I'll just kick off by saying a big welcome back to our listeners and viewers of the Responsible Edge podcast, brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined from across the pond in the very, very early morning by Ellen. Ellen, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the show today.
Thank you, Charlie. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent stuff. Now, Ellen, we've got 20 minutes or so to give our viewers and our listeners a bit of a sort of a rustle through, if you like, of all things you and your background and your career to date. I want to actually start though, by asking you a sort of a fairly specific question. Mm-hmm. Can you recall any kind of really key formative experiences as a child or as a young person that really kind of affected you in terms of your long-term view of ethics and responsibility? Was there anything in your childhood that you can pick out that really sort of focused your attention, if you like, on what was right and what was good?
There is a moment, indeed,
okay, good.
And that is when I went to Poland right after the Berlin Wall came down.
Oh, wow.
Which really, and I was doing my junior year at the London School of Economics. Mm-hmm. And previously, I was in college. I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and I was at college at Wellesley College, and I wanted to be a stockbroker, which had to do with another formative story. But I was very much in the direction of wanting to be a stockbroker, and was majoring in econ. Went to LSE because I thought the word economics was in the name of the school, so it's probably going to be good for me to be a stockbroker because they'll hire me on Wall Street if I have London School of Economics on my resume. And so, and unbeknownst to me, it's really a social policy, public policy, pretty lefty school. And the dorm that I was in, Roseberry Hall, give a shout out to Roseberry Hall, had, 30 so countries represented in that dorm. Every super international experience. So you talk to somebody about Croatia or Kuwait or Pakistan and just learn a lot about the world. So I had this global experience. The wall comes down, and so a number of us decide to go east to explore the war and come home with a chunk of rock from the wall. And we arranged, the LSE arranged, or some student group arranged an exchange program with these students from Poznan University in Poland. Mm-hmm. So we go to Poznan, and a little backstory, backup, is that I'm very business-minded. In college, I had a beaded jewelry business. I actually have things like this. I'm going to show you on the video here. Things I just happen to have this in front of me.
Ellen, sorry, did you say beaded?
Beaded.
Sorry, beaded. Oh, of course.
Not like Michael Jackson beat it, but
okay, beaded.
No, beads. This was at the time where like hematite and crystals and rose quartz, and they would have like these properties. So I had this beaded jewelry business on campus, and I would sell at Wellesley. And I would make jewelry, and it was, the name of the company was Designs, D-Zines.
Nice.
And I was selling, and so I had a business, I had a platform. Okay, that's just a little backstory, because I was walking along the streets in Poznan, and I saw these women from the Tatras Mountains who'd come down from the Tatras Mountains, and there are sheep and goats in the mountains, and they would shear the sheep and make these sweaters. Here's a knit sweater here, not the original. They would sell them on the streets in Poznan for $3.50. A hand knit wool sweater. I know you've got to adjust for inflation, but believe me, in 1989, that was still, or 1990, it was still that was still very cheap in US standards. And I saw also poverty at a different level because the people in Poland are so educated. And it's a second world country, right? It's not third world country. And at the same time, there's rationing, there's not a lot of food on the table. I did not eat till my belly was full.
Yeah.
It's like, and the host family had each person had one pair of shoes for the whole year. And so when they would come home after a long day, they would clean their shoes and wrap them in a plastic bag to preserve them, because it's like, these shoes need to last you for a full year. So we're going to preserve them for that full, one pair of shoes for 365 days. And so I was struck by this different kind of poverty than I'd ever experienced and the price of things. And I wanted to help out. And I said, I want to do good with business. And
Ellie, let me ask you on that. Was that the sort of 360 moment of thinking that being a stockbroker was not what Ellen wanted to do with the rest of her career? Okay, so this was the moment of
that's the moment. It took me a while to get there, but
okay.
Apologies for the long story.
No. I love it. The detail of it was beautiful, and it's lovely. It's amazing and I think it's often, I speak to people all the time who talk about these sort of, the sort of the very sensory almost experiences that they go through, that they recall, and they recall in real detail. That really does, you can really see that that's the moment when things just clicked, and that young person, that young mind, if you like, saw something and was really truly affected by it. So you described it beautifully.
Yes.
And I interrupted you. Sorry. You at this point you're
well, now I can fast forward to the part of the story is I arranged to buy the $3.50 sweaters. I bought them all up. I bought 30, which was a big win for them. Woohoo, they made $100. And I was like, $100. And then I brought them to campus at Wellesley the next year. And I sold them for, I think, $35. Big markup. And I didn't put that winnings in my pocket. I sent it back to Poznan to support that community group. And that was early days of cause marketing. And Carol Cohn is the mother of cause marketing. She was getting her start in Boston around that time as well. So I didn't know it was called cause marketing at the time, in fact, but it was like I wanted to use business for good. And so that was the turning point.
So you're at this point, you're at your early 20s at this point, I imagine?
20, because I'm still in college, yeah.
Right, and what happens next? So where does I think it's always fascinating to hear about, that moment of inspiration, if you like.
Right.
What do you do with that? Like, what's the next stage? Yeah.
So then I got interested in, and I realized, and another little story was I was peddling. I was a peddler on the streets in Burlington, Vermont. I was selling the same jewelry, and a woman came up to me who said, "Where do these beads come from?" And these are rose quartz, hematite, onyx, like where are they manufactured? And I had never really thought about this. Is when I was 18 or so, 18, 19. Hadn't really thought about supply chain issues. And she had said, she brought up that concept of sweatshops, like maybe there's somebody in a sweatshop that's putting these beads together. And have you ever thought of that? Which I hadn't. So my focus in my bead business changed to how can we use selling beads for good? And I became very interested in African artisans and African beads. And I wanted to go to Africa and after college. And I chose, I chose the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps chose Cameroon, West Africa for me. And so I did, that was a career decision, well aligned with those previous moments.
So you're in your early 20s now. You're finding yourself in Cameroon. You're working for the Peace Corps. What and how much? I mean, you're an entrepreneurially spirited young woman at this point. Like, what was the sort of ambition and intention at that moment in time? Like, how did you see the rest of your career playing out at that moment?
I was very interested in fair trades. Peace Corps connected me with a coffee cooperative project, so I was interested in fair trade coffee. And at that moment in time, I saw myself going into fair trade in some way, which was trading. And there was a group called Aid to Artisans that helps third world artisans come up with products that are useful in the West, and that kind of thing. So that was the direction I was going at the time.
And you can really see when you plot together your experience in Poland, your experience in Cameroon, your experience of your own business, you can see how that all fits together to create that intention, if you like.
Yes.
But what happens next? So we're in Cameroon. First of all, what was your experience like of Cameroon? What did you take away from being there?
Yeah, I mean, yes, fabulous. You get back and people say, "How was Peace Corps?" You're gone for 2.5 years, and you have all these amazing experiences, and you say, "Yeah, it was good." It was great, but it's hard. It's hard to communicate. There's a pillar of Peace Corps, which is to share the experience that you had in Peace Corps with the West when you come back home. I made lovely friends. My best friend was a wood carver, and we learned how to make. I was going to see if I don't have one of those stools, but I used the stools today. So we did wood carving, and I was in a really amazing forest, the Oku Forest in the northwest of Cameroon. I spoke Pidgin English, and I didn't have running water. I had walking water, which is that I paid a girl to head carry buckets of into a drum, and then that drum would feed into my little house.
Wow. I mean, to have, again, coming back to that sensory experience, to have witnessed and to really lived that's an amazing framing, if you like. In all honesty, Ellen, I asked this question of people of what those kind of formative experiences are that have directed them to do what they've done. You've got such an eclectic, multifaceted sort of bulk of experience as a young person that's obviously then just, really inspired you to do what you then go on to do. Talk our listeners through now, sort of from this point onwards, you come back or what happens next from a career perspective?
Right, certainly. So I decided to go to business school, and I wanted to go to a business school where I would not be marginalized for wanting to do good with business. And I recognized there was an organization called Students for Responsible Business at the time, but it was actually Net Impact. Today they rebranded, and I chose the school that had the biggest Net Impact chapter as my first choice for business school, and that was the Yale School of Management. And I graduated SOM in 98, and and my focus there was, at the time, the word was corporate social responsibility, and I was really honing in on supply chains and human rights in the supply chains. I ended up doing a 6-year contract, not hardly every day, but I was on contract at Levi Strauss for 6 years, helping them with sustainability and corporate social responsibility. I also had contracts with Hewlett Packard, and then I was at the World Bank and the IFC for about a year. So I was doing consulting work in the corporate social responsibility, sustainability space. And then in around 2005, I had advice. I did one of my contracts in grad school was at the New Economics Foundation. Do you know, with Simon Zadek, who was one of my mentors in the early days. I would pick up the phone and say New Economics Foundation and see if my accent was true enough. And they had, and Simon had given me the advice that as a sustainability consultant, there were a lot of sustainability consultants out there in the world, and that I should niche. And I am a natural connector. That is my superpower. We could go into other stories about that. But it was because of my connecting people with jobs. I was helping a lot of people with their jobs, and I was helping people get jobs. And I realized that there was a business to be had in the recruiting side. So that means I am retained by companies to fill specific positions. And I've been doing that now for 20 years.
And that's amazing. I think, and we'll come on to talk about more of the specifics of it, but for you to have, during those consultancy days, working for those various organizations that you've alluded to, that kind of CSR to the sort of beginnings of the sustainability agenda movement, if you like, you were right there at the beginning, weren't you, of this? Out of interest, and I know this is a very difficult question to answer, Ellen, but when you think about your view of sustainability, CSR at that time, and you then think about the progress that has been made since then, how would you score the sustainability CSR movement, if you like, in terms of its impact collectively since your early stages of exposure to it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, that does tie into the research that we've done. My company, Weinreb Group, has done research on chief sustainability officers and how that role has evolved. We started that in 2011, and we've done it every other year. So we just produced our 7th.
Which, by the way, Ellen, just to jump in, we'll be referencing and linking to all of Ellen's materials in our editorial, etc. Just as a note.
Fabulous, in the show notes. So, but you're asking a good question as well, which is not 2011, but really in the last 25, 30 years, which is as long as I've been in this space. Certainly, when I first entered this, the sweatshop issue came up a lot because of globalization and a lot of companies moving their production to Asia at the time, global. And so what are the impacts of that? And certainly production in Asia existed before the wall fell down in Berlin, but there was a NAFTA, there were trade agreements that were really increasing that, which actually brings us full forward to trade agreements today in the U.S. So the focus was more on human rights at that very moment, just globally, if you were looking at what's in the news. And certainly now climate change was not front row and center in 30 years ago. Yeah. So that's been more the burning platform. And also this movement started. I mean, I was in Burlington, Vermont, where Ben and Jerry's is located, and there's a lot of these kind of more liberal companies that wanted to do the right thing, and they were leading the pack. And these days, it's so much more standard. It's doing business as usual when your top Fortune 20, Fortune 50, all of these companies are really engaged and involved. And so that's probably, I'd say, the biggest shift.
Super interesting. The sort of the commonality, if you like, of embedding these things into organizations is certainly more prevalent. Perhaps the issues have shifted and evolved, but ultimately things are heading in a certainly a more progressive way, you hope. I want to ask you though, and we're going to come on to talk about recruitment and obviously talk about this week's article, sorry. But I would be remiss of me not to have an opportunity when speaking to an expert or, in sustainability operating out of North America for you to just comment on. And I should say we are recording this show on the 6th of March, 2025. So
you have to timestamp these things because 10 days later, we're going to have it's going to be old news, know?
This is my point almost. Yeah. Ellen, I'd love to get your sort of synopsis flavor, if you like, review of what we've experienced in North America over the course of the last couple of months from the perspective of the sustainability agenda. Like, what's your overarching take on what we've seen with the new administration?
Right. Well, it's been challenging for sustainability professionals, and I've been in a number of forum with a number of chief sustainability officers. So it's not just me, my perspective, but my community. It's I'd say there's a lot of anxiety, and at the same time, there's commitment to stay the course. And the advice in general has been to be calm throughout this chaos, and let's just see where the chips fall. The latest news right now is around the omnibus proposal, and in Europe, so on your side of the pond, it's all your fault, right, Charlie? It's that there's this proposal out there, and it could take months and years to sort out. There is a fast track proposal, but companies have been told that to give it some perspective, there's been such a challenge around, they call it like the raters and rankings, and what's standard and what's compliance and what do I need to comply with. And with CSRD, it was a big lift, double materiality. A lot of companies, this is new to them. How do they do that? Partnering with finance. And so they're in a place right now where there's a question of what's in scope and who's in scope and what's the timeline of it. And it's not just like a little project where you pick it up one day and finish it a week later. It's a really long time and a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And so there's just questions and a lot of uncertainty. And I think that certainly plays into the role that a chief sustainability officer plays, or a head of sustainability plays, is to navigate all of the volatility. And there is a lot of volatility.
Which will be really interesting to come back to, I think, when we touch on this this week's article. That there's certainly...
Yeah, it's a great article. I love your selection there.
Oh, Ellen, thank you. Before we go on to the article, I've got one more question before we move on from talking about you. When you think about the rest of your career, and you get your sort of magic ball out, if you like, crystal ball, to have a look at what you're going to do during the rest of it. When you get to the end of your career, what do you want to be able to say about what you did?
Well, we put changemakers to work as a recruiting firm, and so we'll continue to do that. And so when we look at sustainability programs around the world, I can say that I played a role in helping companies find the best people for those leadership jobs, and we also help them fill out their teams.
Very good, very good. I a nice, concise, clean contribution. I think that's yeah. Well, it's a big one, but it's you described it so clearly. Ellen, that was brilliant. Thank you so much for being so open and sharing some really fascinating, especially those formative experiences that you kind of alluded to in various different parts of the world were really, really interesting, and you can see how that's influenced sort of what you've then gone on to do. Let's move on though now. Would you mind just providing our listeners with a bit of a summary and pulling out the key themes from the article? I think it was the Trade Show News Network in August last year, which I think again is particularly interesting in terms of thinking about whether or not
August 2024. Yeah.
Things have evolved and changed. But would you mind just providing a bit of a summary and pulling out whatever you thought were the most interesting points from the piece?
Right. So it's called Building a High Impact Sustainability Team, a strategic guide. And what I love about it is there's these key steps in how to build a sustainability team. And I love the tone of this article, which is this really ties into a FAQ that I receive, which is, I want to be a sustainability professional. How do I get into it? And this article is a fabulous first step, which is anybody can be a sustainability professional. I as a recruiter place sustainability leaders. Oftentimes they have sustainability in their title, but you don't have to have sustainability in your title to be a sustainability professional. Meaning, and this article gives anyone that says, hey, take the initiative and just start your own sustainability team. And I think it makes a lot of sense.
Ellen, let me ask you a question on that. I've heard various different people suggest that really the whole notion of a sustainability team, a green team, a particular department.
I want to interrupt you about that.
Okay, go on.
One of my critiques of the article is they say a sustainability team or a green team, and I would say these are two very different things. So let's just make that clarification before we go on in your questioning.
Perfect, Ellen. Well, you then define those for us. So in your mind, what's the difference between a sustainability team and a green team?
Right. So a sustainability team is when some senior executive has determined, somewhere along the lines in talent and HR, they've determined, or somebody who's taking on these responsibilities determines that this needs to be its own function. It's often 4 people, can be 1, absolutely can be 1, but that's your VP of sustainability. And that is their job. They've been anointed to be the sustainability leader, and that there's a sustainability strategy and an agenda. A green team is employees who have a day job who want to do sustainability. And we can also jump into, the article touches on the 2 types of green teams as well. And so, so I definitely want to make that clarification.
Very well made, Alan. Well, I've had various different conversations with people where we've talked about the necessity to move away from this isolation or this siloing, if you like, of the, I'm going to use my terms interchangeably here to confuse matters, but the sustainability function within an organization, and instead for everyone in an organization to understand that their role, to a greater or lesser extent, is going to have a sustainability element as part of it, and that actually the most forward-thinking organizations, the ones that sort of empower and embolden all employees, all staff, in order to take on some responsibility for the sustainability of the organization itself. Just touch on that from your perspective, Ellen. Do you think that's realistic? Do you think that's preferable or not?
Sure. Okay, so with sustainability positions where that owning some level of sustainability or being at the helm, I always say that you need somebody at the helm. You need at least one person to own it. Like, for example, what's going on in the US right now with and in Europe with compliance, regulatory. There needs to be somebody who's in charge of, at the helm, throw anything at them. They're the ones who figure it out. There has been a move for few people on that sustainability function, and a lot of, I call them embeds, a lot of people embedded, a lot of dotted lines to the head of sustainability. And so certainly if there's like sustainable packaging within the packaging department, or sustainable supply chain within supply chain, and they don't have to necessarily have that title, but there needs to be that sustainability person or people that own some level of the sustainability of those various pieces of the business. So that's certainly out there. There is also a notion that everybody needs to own the strategy. And some companies have those sustainability targets tied to their pay, can be aligned for all executives or all employees or all departments. So there's certainly ways to embed sustainability into the business in a very kind of big way. Another point that goes to a question you asked several minutes ago around sustainability strategy and or how has sustainability changed in the last 25 years or so. And that is one of the big shifts, is that sustainability is tied to the business and the sustainability strategy is tied to the business strategy, as opposed to, okay, we've got this side of the business, kind of like the philanthropy side of the business, where we're just going to do good out there in the world. Now it's like we need to tie it to the business and it needs to make business sense.
And is that because, Ellen, actually when people are realizing a sustainability strategy in essence is just a good business strategy because of the efficiencies, because of the risk management, because of the long-term kind of planning that having a really clear and effective sustainability strategy can have on the commercial business strategy of the organization as well? Is it that realization collectively we've gone, oh, wait a minute, being sustainable is just about being a good business?
I mean, that's the value of this double materiality of CSRD is recognizing what's material topics and where does that tie on. I mean, there's materiality and there's double materiality, but there's and identifying what's material to that company.
And Ellen, just for our listeners, sorry to interrupt you, but just for our listeners that aren't aware, just briefly describe what materiality and double materiality refers to.
So materiality is around what is important material to your business. And so originally in reporting years ago, that was part of the GRI protocol, was to identify what topics are material. So if I'm Microsoft, I have all these servers that are helping to power our tools. And so we're looking at the carbon in the servers, or how much carbon is used in those data centers. So that's an example of a material topic. And if I'm making clothes, then what's material is where does the material come from? Is there runoff? Are there chemicals there's in the supply chain that are impacting the communities that are producing those? So that's just identifying. It's really just saying that it's industry specific and company specific, and that what might apply to Microsoft doesn't apply to Levi Strauss.
Brilliant.
Necessarily.
Okay. Well, thank you for defining that for us. I think that's really helpful.
And double materiality, just to answer that other question you asked, is around tying sustainability strategy and material topics to the business.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you for that. And so coming back to the question of embedding sustainability throughout your organization, what are, in your experiences, the biggest mistakes that organizations make when formulating or putting together their sustainability teams? Like what are the big issues at play, and how in your experience do you go about recommending that your clients avoid those?
Well, I think one of the tensions right now is that there's so much push for compliance and so much heads and tails that makes anyone's head spin around the compliance and do I need to do this and what? And so then there's the question of how do you get resources and how allocate resources, and at the end of the day, the focus should be on impact and strategy, and does this make business sense? And it's hard to keep your eye on the prize when it comes to strategy, when there's so much volatility in the market. I'd say that's the biggest challenge right now.
And out of interest, how does that then play out? I mean, you mentioned that your kind of key focus is on the recruitment and the placement of CSOs. Specifically when it comes to the sustainability leads within these organizations, what are the most common mistakes that organizations make in terms of appointing the wrong CSO for a particular organization?
Well, one of the challenges I would say is that that company, when they start their sustainability journey, they don't realize what they're getting into. And it usually turns out to be bigger than anticipated. And they see the value. So I think, at the beginning, they think, oh, I'll just put a junior person in here to respond to these questions. And then slowly it's like, well, actually, there's a lot of questions and we need to make heads and tails of it. So actually, I think we need a director level. And really what's valuable is to bring somebody in pretty senior. I mean, it doesn't have to be C, but pretty relatively senior. And that person needs to have these specific characteristics so that they're influencing change and they have access to the C-suite, to the decision makers.
And what are those characteristics? What are those really great characteristics of CSOs that you've identified?
Yeah. So that actually ties to our report, where we have surveyed. So we look at the number of CSOs every year, and very specifically, it is US centric. It's chiefs. Their title has to be Chief Sustainability Officer. They have to have those 3 words in their title. They need to be working for US publicly traded companies based in the US. Mm-hmm. And so we've looked at that number. And there were about 30 in 2011 when we first did the report. And now we're up to about 220. And we've seen a big rise. And they were doubling. In general, they were doubling the last 2 reports. We were reporting, hey, the number of CSOs has doubled. Mm-hmm. This report found that the number of CSOs increased by 20%. So it didn't double. Which implies that it might be tapering off a little bit, it's still on the rise, net, it's still rising, but not as big of a rate. And
Ellen, is that purely down to the geopolitical atmosphere of the last couple of years, or what do you put that down to, that we're not seeing the rate at the same height as it was before?
I'd say it's slowing down for 2 reasons. One of them is that there's some pushback there's pushback from from a policy perspective. There's some conservative efforts that are there's anti-green, that ties to your charter. Mm-hmm. There's also around anti-climate change in the conservative states in the US. And so there certainly have been those challenges that are making the decision and the kind of the all systems go. There are countered with some all systems actually don't go, and so that's certainly a challenge that's going on. The other is that there's just a lot of companies for the most part that are really committed, and we have data on that that's really related to the research. But your question was around the attributes of mm-hmm. We talked a lot about kind of in general the research, but you were also asking about the attributes of these leaders. And so there are 220 chief sustainability officers in our last report that just came out in February of 2025. And then we surveyed those 220, and we got about a third of them that responded. So we have a survey from about 70 chief sustainability officers of U.S. mm-hmm. public companies, and we asked them what are their attributes that make them successful in their role. And the one attribute, we've asked this question over time, the one attribute that comes out again and again and again is the attribute of being a corporate chameleon. Okay. And then there's also around systems change and being able to think at the big level as well as the granular level. So those are some of the key attributes. I do a lot of research and discussions around what's the difference between a sustainability leader and a corporate leader, like what makes a sustainability leader different. And one is around interpreting what's going on outside in the world and bringing it back to the company. And then the other is then to communicate and influence change, because it's not just, hey, you've got this big team out here and you're doing good. It's that there are key leaders that are owning pieces of the strategy. And in order to do that, this chief sustainability officer needs to speak the language of whatever team or function or person that they're talking to. Where it's shifted lately is that one of these key people is the legal department and the chief financial officer. And so in terms of skills, because there's attributes and there's also skills, one of the skills that CSOs are being asked to have fluency in is around is working with finance. It's not just making the case for sustainability, but it's also understanding how to make the data verified from an accounting perspective. So there's like the rise of the ESG controller, and there's a lot of work kind of on the finance side. So that's one skill that the CSOs are picking up more, is that fluency in the finance side of the business.
And it's super interesting. I recall a conversation I've had not long ago where we were talking about the need for sustainability leads to be the ultimate sort of internal corporate diplomats, and how actually what you're needing to do is to go around and understand the status quo positions of many of the departments we're engaging with, and understanding that they all need to have their own individual case presented to them. They all need to be spoken to in the language that they can understand and they can appreciate.
Exactly. Yes.
The diplomatic role is to then consider all of these different, possibly divergent perspectives and divergent motivations, and being able to pull the whole thing together. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think that notion of chameleon or diplomat, whatever way you want to call it, is absolutely crucial. Was there anything in your research from this year that surprised you?
Yeah, I think one of the more interesting findings is that because we have this longitudinal research, we were able to, we know like the class of 2011, we know them, right? The people that the 29 CSOs from the time, and we have data on each of those classes in the 7 times we've done it. And so this is the first time that I thought, let's look at what their title was before they were CSO. And so we looked at all the CSOs that we've looked at since 2011 and what title did they hold beforehand. And one of the ahas for me, I hadn't anticipated, is that today only a half of CSOs had a sustainability title beforehand. Which means that they're doing other things before half are doing other things. And if you're a sustainability director and you want to be a CSO, the question is, well, you might get, the next CSO might actually be the head of supply chain or the chief legal officer or that kind of thing. And another finding was that the legal team, and back in the early days, nobody from legal would touch this role. And now that's actually in second place at about, let's say, 15% are coming from legal. And so that's like, if they're not coming from sustainability, where are they coming from? In 2011, a lot of them were coming from environmental health and safety or affairs, like corporate affairs, community affairs. And a lot, I'd say environmental health and safety is really kind of what this, if anything, what sustainability evolved from.
And it's super interesting. I think for anyone I myself are definitely going to get a hand on this report, because it sounds fascinating. There's a few things I want to sort of drive into myself, but thank you for introducing it to us. Ellen, can you believe we've absolutely rattled through our conversation this morning? For me,
it's been fabulous.
Let me finish and conclude by asking you the magic wand question. So Ellen, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
I think if consumers had full information, then they could make informed buying decisions. And so I think with AI and big data, but it's on the way, it's out there, but I'd love for consumers to have more available to them at their fingertips.
Here, Ellen. I think, especially with the work in our world, I couldn't concur with that any more than I'm suggesting. Fantastic Magic Wand suggestion. Thank you for making it. Ellen, it's been a delight to have you on. Thank you for joining us today. Hopefully we'll have you back for another show in the future.
All right. Thanks so much, Charlie. Have a good day.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to Ellen Weinreb, CEO and founder of Weinreb Group, a pioneering executive search firm placing sustainability and ESG leaders across global businesses. Today, Ellen and I explored insights from the article Building a High-Impact Sustainability Team, a Strategic Guide, discussing how companies can embed sustainability into their core strategy, the importance of cross-functional collaboration, and how strong internal sustainability teams can drive both innovation and long-term value. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.